"He must have come in to steal something," whispered Nurse Jake to his colleague, discreetly pointing at Pedro, a 32-year-old who had just walked through the automatic doors of the Mount Sinai Hospital A in New York. His plain clothes, a wrinkled button-down shirt and faded jeans, stood in stark contrast to the spotless hospital setting. Pedro carried only a worn-out backpack and scanned the room with a mix of fatigue and urgency in his eyes. What Jake and the entire staff didn't know was that this man, whom they were already judging for his clothes and heavy accent, was in fact Dr. Pedro Mendoza, the most renowned cardiovascular surgeon in Guatemala, who had just arrived in the United States to take on a position that would change not only his own life, but the lives of everyone in that eon that Monday morning. Pedro timidly approached the reception desk, where head nurse Margaret, a 45-year-old with over 2 decades of experience, didn't even lift her eyes from the computer screen. "Can I help you?" she asked in a mechanical tone, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. Pedro tried to explain in his imperfect English that he needed to speak with Dr. Harrison, the chief of surgery, but his words came out jumbled from nerves and the exhaustion of a 16-hour trip. Margaret sighed loudly, rolled her eyes, and waved him off impatiently. "Look, if you don't have insurance and it's not an emergency, you'll need to go to the free clinic across town," she said, automatically assuming he was just another undocumented immigrant looking for free care. Her cold voice echoed down the hall, drawing curious glances and a few stifled laughs from the other staff. At that moment, I watched the scene unfold with a mix of discomfort and recognition. Having witnessed countless similar situations over the years, I knew exactly what was happening. Once again, prejudice was louder than humanity. Pedro insisted gently, pulling a crumpled envelope from his backpack. "Please, I have documents." "I'm a doctor," he said, holding out what looked like official papers. Margaret barely glanced at them before pushing them back. "Sure you are," she replied sarcastically. "Everyone who walks in here claims to be a doctor or a lawyer back in their country." More staff began to gather, entertained by what they considered another Monday morning show. What none of them noticed was how Pedro remained composed in the face of humiliation, his trembling hands not from fear, but from a deep frustration I recognized instantly, the pain of not being seen for who you truly are. Suddenly, the emergency alarm blared through the hospital. "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. The operator's urgent voice sliced through the air. A patient had arrived in cardiac arrest, the victim of a severe car crash. Margaret immediately abandoned her post, rushing toward the trauma room with Jake and the others close behind. Pedro, completely ignored just moments earlier, stood frozen at the desk, watching the chaos erupt. For a moment, his eyes closed, and I could see something shift in his expression, a subtle but powerful transformation. It was as if he had made a decision that would define not just this moment, but his entire future in America. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer the weary, uncertain immigrant. He was Dr. Pedro Mendoza, and his medical instincts had taken over. Without hesitation, Pedro followed the sounds of shouting and alarms, striding firmly toward the trauma bay. Through the glass he saw a scene all too familiar. A man in his 40s lay unconscious on the gurney, his vitals crashing on the monitor doctor. Stevens, the attending physician, was visibly panicked. His hands shook as he fumbled with a failed intubation attempt. "We're losing him." "I can't get the airway." Stevens shouted at Margaret, who was pressing dressings against the patient's bleeding chest. It was total desperation, and in everyone's eyes I could see they knew the battle was slipping away. Then Pedro, without asking permission, pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Let me help," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, so unlike anything they had heard from him before. The room froze, all eyes snapping toward him as if they were seeing a ghost. "What the hell are you doing here?" Get out immediately. Dr. Stevens barked, his voice a mix of rage and panic. Margaret also moved defensively, as if Pedro were a threat to order. But Pedro didn't budge. His eyes were locked on the monitor, analyzing the rhythms with the precision only years of experience could bring. He's in ventricular fibrillation, Pedro said steadily. You're wasting time on the intubation. He needs an emergency cricothyrotomy now. The words rolled off his tongue with a technical confidence that made everyone pause. Jake, standing in the corner prepping meds, frowned. That wasn't the vocabulary of someone who had studied medicine on Google. It was the language of a seasoned professional, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt began to spread across the room. The patient flatlined. The monitor's steady, haunting tone filled the air like a death knell. Doctor. Stevens was lost. His resuscitation attempts disorganized and ineffective. That's when Pedro stepped forward and something extraordinary happened. Without even touching the patient at first, he began directing the team with a natural authority that turned chaos into order. Margaret, prepare epinephrine, 1 milligram 4. Jake, get me a cricothyrotomy kit now, doctor. Stevens, keep compressions going, but shift your hands 2 centimeters left. His voice was firm, clear, each command precise, like a man who had saved hundreds of lives before. And most astonishingly, everyone obeyed instinctively, as though they recognized true medical authority in his words, even if they still didn't fully understand who he was. The patient teetered on the edge of death, but Pedro's calm orchestration cut through the panic. When Jake hesitated, questioning if he should really follow a stranger, Pedro looked at him and simply said, 3 minutes. That's all we have. Jake handed him the kit without another word. Pedro pulled on the gloves Margaret handed him almost automatically, and his hands, the same ones that had trembled at the reception desk minutes earlier, now moved with absolute surgical precision. In under 2 minutes, he had secured a new airway, allowing the patient to breathe again. The hiss of air filling the man's lungs was like music to everyone's ears. A deafening silence followed. The monitor flickered back to stable vitals. The patient was breathing. Pedro slowly removed his gloves, his eyes still fixed on the monitor, making sure all readings were normal. Finally, Margaret broke the silence with the question everyone was thinking, Who are you? Her voice trembled, caught between awe and shame. Pedro turned to face her, and for a moment I saw profound sadness in his eyes, not for the life he had just fought to save, but for the humiliation he had endured only minutes before. I tried to tell you, he said softly. I'm Dr. Pedro Mendoza, cardiovascular surgeon. I arrived this morning to take my post in this hospital's surgical department. His words landed in the room like a silent explosion. Jake was the first to react, his legs shaking. Oh my God, he whispered, covering his mouth. You're the new surgeon, doctor. Harrison's been waiting for. Margaret leaned against the wall, her face pale. Doctor? Stevens looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. The realization hit them like a crushing weight. They had treated the internationally acclaimed heart surgeon, the man, specifically recruited by their hospital for his groundbreaking reputation, like a beggar, like a potential criminal. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she replayed every dismissive word, every disdainful glance she had thrown at Pedro. I didn't know, she stammered. Your documents, I didn't even look at them. Guilt was written all over her face, the kind of guilt I knew she would carry for a long time. Just then, the trauma room doors swung open and Dr. Harrison, a tall man with gray hair and an imposing presence, rushed in. I heard about the code. How's the... He stopped abruptly when he saw Pedro standing by the bed, still wearing surgical gloves. His face lit up with a genuine smile. Dr. Mendoza, you made it. I was worried when I didn't see you at reception. Pedro turned to greet him. and the contrast in treatment was impossible to miss. Harrison approached warmly, hand extended. "How was the trip? I hope everything's been in order here." The awkward silence that followed was razor sharp. Harrison glanced around, instantly sensing the tension. Did something happen? Pedro took a deep breath, clearly weighing his response. He could have lashed out, could have used the moment to humiliate those who had humiliated him. But what he did next revealed why he was not only an extraordinary surgeon, but also an extraordinary human being. "Dr. Harrison," he said calmly, "there was a small misunderstanding at reception. But the important thing is that we saved a life here. This patient was in cardiac arrest and needed immediate intervention." He gestured toward the bed where the man now lay stable. "Your team is very capable. We worked together perfectly." Margaret stared at Pedro in disbelief and gratitude. He was protecting them, claiming the success as a team effort when he could have easily exposed their failures. Harrison smiled, impressed. "That's exactly what we were hoping for from you, Dr. Mendoza. We've heard about your work in Guatemala, especially your innovations in minimally invasive cardiac surgery. It's an honor to have you with us." He turned to the team. "I trust you've had the chance to meet our new colleague, Dr. Mendoza. Comes with the highest recommendations and remarkable experience in emergency cardiac care. If the floor could have swallowed Margaret, Jake, and Dr. Stevens whole in that moment, I'm certain they would have welcomed it." With each word of praise Harrison gave Pedro, the weight of their prejudice and premature judgment pressed heavier on them. Jake hung his head, unable to meet Pedro's eyes, remembering his cruel comment about thieves walking into the hospital. When Harrison finally left to arrange the patient's transfer to the ICU, a heavy silence lingered. Pedro began removing the equipment he had used, his movements slow and deliberate. Margaret was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Mendoza, I don't have the words to apologize." Tears streamed down her face. "I judged you for your appearance, for your accent. I was cruel and prejudiced. You tried to show me your documents and I didn't even look." Pedro stopped, turned to face her, and studied her for a long moment. I could see the struggle in his eyes, pain, but also something deeper, understanding. "Margaret," he finally said, "I came to the United States because I believe I can make a difference here. But moments like this remind me there's still so much work to do, not just in medicine, but in how we see one another." Jake approached hesitantly, his hands trembling. "Dr. Mendoza," I said terrible things about you. I thought you were a criminal. How can you forgive me after that?" Pedro placed a hand on the young nurse's shoulder, a simple gesture carrying enormous weight. "Jake, we all carry biases. What matters is what we do once we recognize them." He paused, locking eyes with him. "You have a choice now. You can let this experience make you wiser and more compassionate, or you can let guilt consume you. I'd prefer you choose wisdom." The impact of those words was visible. Jake nodded quickly, wiping away tears streaming freely down his face. In that moment, I witnessed something rare, the birth of a new awareness, a genuine transformation that would forever change how that young man saw the world. Dr. Stevens, who had remained silent, finally stepped forward. "Dr. Mendoza," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I witnessed your skill today. I saw how you saved a life. I was losing." He paused, searching for words. "But more than that, I saw your dignity in the face of our ignorance. You could have humiliated us, could have exposed us to Dr. Harrison. Instead, you protected us." Pedro shook his head gently. "Dr. Stevens, medicine teaches us to first do no harm. That applies not only to our patients, but also to one another. Humiliating you would save no lives, nor would it make this hospital better." His words echoed through the room as a lesson in leadership that transcended hierarchy. It was pure humanity in action. Watching that collective transformation, I realized I was witnessing something far greater than the revelation of an identity. I was witnessing deep human growth, a lesson that would reach far beyond those hospital walls. Pedro had become more than a celebrated surgeon. He had become a teacher of humanity. Margaret approached again, her eyes now filled with determination. "Dr. Mendoza, I want you to know this will never happen again, not while I'm here. I'll make sure every member of this hospital staff understands that dignity and respect don't depend on how someone looks or where they come from." Pedro smiled genuinely for the first time since his arrival. "Thank you, Margaret. That's all I could ask, that this experience builds bridges, not walls." 3 weeks later, I saw how that transformative moment had spread throughout the entire hospital. Pedro had become not just an exceptional surgeon performing life-saving procedures daily, but also a respected mentor. Margaret had implemented cultural sensitivity training for the staff, and Jake had become one of the most vocal advocates for diversity. Most striking of all, Doctor, Stevens had asked to work directly under Pedro's supervision, humbly seeking to learn from someone he had once underestimated. The patient Pedro had saved that first day, a man named Michael, had fully recovered and made a point of telling everyone about the guardian angel in disguise who had given him a second chance at life. The story spread quickly, turning Pedro into a living legend within Mount Sinai Hospital. But perhaps the most touching moment came one night after a particularly long shift. Near midnight, Pedro walked the same halls where he had been humiliated weeks earlier. Margaret, working the night shift, spotted him and called out, "Dr. Mendoza, thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Pedro asked, genuinely curious. "For teaching me that true leadership doesn't come from the position we hold, but from how we treat people when we think no one is watching." Pedro stopped, tears forming in his eyes. "Margaret, thank you for reminding me that we're all capable of change and growth. Your courage to transform inspires me every day." They embraced two professionals who had found a deep human connection through the acknowledgement of their flaws and the determination to be better. A year later, I was present at the hospital's annual ceremony when Pedro was named Physician of the Year. But what made that moment truly special wasn't the thunderous applause or Dr. Harrison's glowing remarks about his groundbreaking surgical innovations. It was seeing Margaret, Jake, and Dr. Stevens in the front row, clapping through tears, knowing they had been part of a transformation far greater than themselves. In his acceptance speech, Pedro didn't talk about his medical achievements. Instead, he told the story of that first day without naming names, but honoring the courage of those who chose to grow from their mistakes. "True medicine," he said, "doesn't only happen in operating rooms. It happens every time we choose to see the humanity in one another, every time we decide to heal not just bodies but also hearts and minds." The entire hospital stood, applauding not just an extraordinary surgeon, but an extraordinary human being who had transformed an entire institution through example and compassion. And so, as I reflect on that transformative morning at Mount Sinai Hospital, I realize Pedro Mendoza's story isn't just about an immigrant surgeon proving his worth against prejudice. It's a story about all of us, about how our assumptions can blind us to the greatness around us, and about how true healing begins when we have the courage to face our mistakes and grow from them. Pedro didn't just save a life that day. He saved the soul of a medical team and, by extension, of an entire institution. He taught us that dignity isn't found in titles or recognition, but in how we treat one another, especially when no one is watching. And perhaps most importantly, he showed us that medicine's greatest miracles don't just happen in operating rooms. They happen every time we choose to see the human being behind the label, every time we decide to build bridges instead of walls. Because in the end, we are all strangers in a strange land, simply hoping to be seen, understood, and accepted for who we truly are.